The blazing studio lights of NBC's Stage 8 cast harsh shadows across the iconic Tonight Show desk as David Mitchell adjusted his tie and prepared for what would become the most catastrophic interview mistake in television history. September 23, 1997. Al Pacino sat in the guest chair, his dark eyes scanning the audience of 300 people who had no idea they were about to witness a career-ending moment that would be replayed for decades. At 57, Al had agreed to this appearance reluctantly, his publicist insisting that promoting Donnie Brasco required mainstream television exposure, even though every instinct told him that late-night talk shows were hunting grounds for hosts looking to create viral moments at their guests' expense. But what happened in the next 18 minutes wouldn't just destroy David Mitchell's career. It would redefine how the entertainment industry understood the relationship between age, relevance, and authentic artistic achievement. The atmosphere in Studio 8 was electric with the particular energy that surrounded major celebrity interviews. Mitchell had spent the past hour in makeup, rehearsing his questions with producers who'd briefed him on Al's recent string of smaller films, his perceived decline from the peak years of Godfather and Scarface. The show's writers had crafted what they believed were cleverly provocative questions designed to generate headlines and social media buzz, the kind of manufactured controversy that drove ratings in an increasingly competitive late-night landscape. Al had arrived at the studio 45 minutes early, a habit he'd developed over 3 decades of professional interviews. He'd observed the controlled chaos of television production. Camera operators testing angles, sound technicians adjusting microphone levels, producers whispering urgently into headsets about timing and commercial breaks. The environment felt hostile in ways that movie sets never did, driven by ratings and advertising revenue rather than artistic vision. Mr. Pacino, we're honored to have you here, Mitchell had said during the pre-interview warm-up, his smile carrying the practiced charm of someone who'd perfected the art of appearing genuine while calculating every interaction for maximum entertainment value. I hope you're ready for some fun questions. Al had nodded politely, though something in Mitchell's tone suggested that fun and respectful weren't necessarily synonymous in this context. The show's opening monologue proceeded with Mitchell's trademark blend of political humor and celebrity gossip, his delivery smooth and confident as he worked an audience primed to laugh at his setup and punchlines. When he announced Al's name, the applause was warm but not overwhelming, the kind of reception reserved for respected veterans rather than current box office champions. Ladies and gentlemen, Mitchell announced with television-perfect enthusiasm, please welcome the legendary Al Pacino. Al walked across the stage with measured steps, acknowledging the audience's applause with a brief wave before settling into the guest chair. Under the harsh studio lighting, every line in his face was visible, every gray hair in his still thick mane caught by cameras that seemed designed to emphasize age rather than minimize it. Al Pacino! Mitchell exclaimed, extending his hand with exaggerated excitement. Great to have you here. You look fantastic. Thank you, David, Al replied, his voice carrying the controlled intensity that had made him famous but none of the defensive edge that guests usually displayed when they sensed potential ambush. So, Donnie Brasco, Mitchell began, settling behind his desk with the comfortable authority of someone who'd conducted over 1,000 celebrity interviews. Fantastic film. You play an undercover FBI agent infiltrating the mob. How do you prepare for a role like that? The question seemed safe, professional, exactly the kind of setup that allowed actors to discuss their craft without controversy. Al responded thoughtfully, describing his months of research with real FBI agents, his exploration of the psychological cost of long-term undercover work, the moral complexity of forming genuine friendships with people you're planning to betray. That's incredible preparation, Mitchell said, nodding with apparent admiration. You're famous for that kind of deep character work. Method acting, they call it. Al smiled slightly, recognizing the potential setup but choosing to engage honestly. I don't like labels, but yes, I believe in thorough preparation. Understanding not just what a character does, but why he does it. The audience was engaged, leaning forward slightly as they listened to insights about creative process from one of cinema's most respected actors. Several people in the front rows were taking notes, as if they were attending a master class rather than a late-night entertainment show. "Now, Al," Mitchell continued, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly towards something more pointed, "you've had an incredible career. Godfather, Serpico, Scarface. I mean, legendary performances that defined American cinema." The compliments felt like setup, though Al couldn't yet see where Mitchell was heading. He nodded graciously, understanding that television interviews often required patience with hosts who needed to establish context before reaching their real questions. "But I have to ask," Mitchell said, his voice taking on the tone of someone about to address an uncomfortable truth, "don't you think Hollywood has evolved past the Al Pacino style of acting?" The studio audience shifted slightly, sensing that the interview was moving into more challenging territory. Al's expression remained unchanged, but several camera operators noticed his posture straighten almost imperceptibly. "What do you mean by that?" Al asked, his voice calm but carrying a new edge of attention. "Well," Mitchell said, gaining confidence as he sensed what he believed was vulnerability, "your intensity. Your volume. The HOOAH thing. It worked great in the 70s and 80s, but today's audiences want something more subtle. More naturalistic." The criticism was delivered with the kind of casual authority that television hosts used when they believed they were expressing widely held opinions. Several audience members exchanged glances, recognizing that Mitchell was pushing boundaries that most interviewers respected. "You think my approach is outdated?" Al asked, his voice remaining controlled despite the obvious provocation. "Not outdated," Mitchell said with mock diplomacy, "just, of its time. I mean, when you look at today's leading men, Leonardo DiCaprio, Brad Pitt, Matt Damon, they have this effortless quality. This natural charm. They don't need to." He gestured vaguely with his hands, mimicking exaggerated emotion. The insult was surgical, delivered with enough politeness to maintain plausible deniability while clearly suggesting that Al's entire approach to acting was excessive and old-fashioned. The studio audience was now completely quiet, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the usually careful world of celebrity interviews. "And let's be honest," Mitchell continued, perhaps mistaking Al's silence for acceptance, "when was the last time you had a real hit? When was the last time you surprised anyone?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, drawing the attention of every person in Studio 8. Mitchell had just questioned not only Al's current relevance but his future viability, in front of millions of viewers and an industry that measured success primarily through box office returns. But instead of the defensive response Mitchell expected, Al did something that made every experienced camera operator in the studio suddenly more alert. He smiled. Not the practiced smile of media training, but something deeper, more dangerous. The kind of smile that suggested someone had just made a mistake they would regret for the rest of their career. "David," Al said, his voice taking on a quality that made everyone in the studio lean forward despite themselves, "can I tell you what past your prime really looks like?" "Past your prime," Al began, his voice gaining the controlled intensity that had defined his greatest performances, "is a man who's spent 15 years asking other people about their risks while never taking any himself." The studio fell into the kind of silence that only occurred when audiences sensed they were witnessing something historic. Mitchell's confident expression flickered slightly, but he maintained his television smile. "Past your prime is someone who thinks age equals irrelevance, that wisdom equals weakness, that experience equals exhaustion," Al continued, his words carrying the precise timing of someone who'd spent decades understanding how to hold an audience's attention through pure force of personality. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in his chair, perhaps beginning to recognize that he'd miscalculated the dynamic of this interview entirely. Al stood slowly from the guest chair, his movement so controlled and deliberate that every camera in the studio automatically adjusted to follow him. The audience was mesmerized, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in late-night television history. "You asked when I last surprised anyone," Al said, his voice building with passionate conviction. "Let me surprise you right now, David. 3 weeks ago, I got a letter from a police officer in Detroit. He said watching Serpico 24 years after it was made convinced him to report corruption in his department. Said it almost cost him his job, but it saved his integrity. The studio was electric with tension now, every person present understanding that Al was systematically dismantling not just Mitchell's questions but his entire worldview about art, relevance, and authentic achievement. 2 months ago, Al continued, his voice gaining power, I met a young veteran whose father died in Vietnam. He told me that watching Scarface helped him understand how trauma can turn self-medication into self-destruction. Helped him get clean after 8 years of addiction. Mitchell's face had gone pale under the studio makeup, his legendary quick-wit apparently deserting him for the first time in his professional career. That's not past my prime, David, Al said, his voice carrying absolute authority. That's what prime means. When your work changes lives instead of just generating box office receipts. When you're still exploring human truth that matters to people you'll never meet. Al took a step closer to Mitchell's desk, his presence somehow filling the entire studio despite his modest physical stature. You want to talk about my volume? My intensity? Let me tell you what intensity really means, Al said, his voice taking on the controlled menace that had made him legendary. Intensity is what happens when you care so much about authentic human experience that you're willing to risk your psychological stability to explore it. The audience was completely captivated, several people in the front rows visibly emotional as they witnessed Al's passionate defense of artistic integrity. When I prepared to play Michael Corleone, Al continued, his voice building towards something that would become television legend, I spent 2 years learning what it costs a good man to become a monster for his family. I explored psychological territory so dark, so morally complex, that I had nightmares for months afterward. Mitchell sat frozen behind his desk, understanding too late that he'd challenged someone operating on a level he could never reach. When I became Tony Montana, Al said, his voice gaining even more intensity, I had to understand what cocaine does to a man's capacity for violence and empathy. I went so deep into that character's psychosis that I needed therapy for 6 months afterward to separate myself from his worldview. Al's eyes locked onto Mitchell's with laser focus, his gaze carrying the kind of concentrated attention that had intimidated some of Hollywood's most powerful figures. That's not outdated, David. That's not excessive. That's what authentic art requires, the willingness to risk everything you are to become something you've never been, Al said, his voice reaching a crescendo that filled every corner of the silent studio. But you wouldn't understand that, Al continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper but somehow carrying more devastating power than any shout. Because you've spent your entire career in the safety of this chair, asking questions about risks you've never taken, judging work you could never create. The silence that followed was profound and transformative. 300 audience members sat motionless, millions of television viewers held their breath, and David Mitchell experienced the complete collapse of everything he thought he understood about power dynamics in celebrity interviews. HOOAH isn't a catchphrase, David, Al said, his voice taking on a tone of almost pity. It's what you say when you've pushed yourself beyond what you thought was possible and discovered you're still standing. It's what you say when you've survived exploring the darkest corners of human experience and found light there. Mitchell's hands were visibly shaking as he gripped his note cards, his legendary television confidence completely shattered by the most devastating intellectual destruction ever broadcast on network television. So when you ask if I'm past my prime, Al said, delivering what would become the most quoted television interview response in entertainment history, remember that my prime isn't measured by box office numbers or demographic appeal. My prime is measured by whether I'm still brave enough to risk everything for authentic human truth. Al straightened his jacket with deliberate dignity, his movement controlled and final. And as long as there are stories worth telling, as long as there are truths worth exploring, as long as there are lives worth changing through authentic art, Al said, his voice carrying absolute conviction, I will never be past my prime. The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds before the studio audience erupted in the longest standing ovation in tonight's show history. But David Mitchell never recovered from those 18 minutes of live television. His ratings collapsed within weeks, the network cancelled his show 6 months later, and he never worked in television again. Al Pacino had just proven that some comebacks don't just end interviews, they end entire careers.